I'm good. Hey everybody, thanks for coming to this one. As you can probably tell from the title, this is going to be a totally ridiculous talk. So if you take yourself seriously, there's other talks that are awesome. So here we go. I guess before I get started, I want to thank Saintcon for taking a chance at a really non-traditional talk. Shout out to Kelly and folks. Also, this is my first time in Utah, and it's actually like a really beautiful state. That's the shot from my hotel. So I sent that to my friends and I said, guys, check this out. And they're like, Chad, that's amazing. And I'm like, yeah, can you believe how close that Arby's is? I'm gonna move here. So amazing, beautiful place. So moving on to the agenda. So this pretty much sums it up. If you can't tell from that, this talk is gonna be about fun. It's not gonna be about work, it's gonna be about fun. Now there's going to be a bunch of things we can take and apply to a professional setting. Really exciting stuff, but generally this is going to be about having fun. So just to give you a warning. So what is this talk about? This talk is about a game that I helped make called Cryptomancer. It's actually a tabletop role-playing game about hacking. It was designed by, well, I used to be a threat and malware hunter or cyber hunter. It actually said that on my business card. That's embarrassing, but also with help from a systems administrator, so somebody who actually has to make the spice flow in an organization. So yeah, it's pretty much traditional Dungeons and Dragons style tabletop role-playing game, but it has a really strong IT core. Good enough to hopefully entertain folks like you, but also enough to kind of teach non-technical people how this stuff works. Just so I know what I'm working with, how many of you have ever played either Dungeons and Dragons or a tabletop role-playing game like that in your life? So almost everybody. I love IT. This is awesome. You're my people. Well, good. So it was built by these three guys. The guy at the top pretends to do security. The guy in the middle actually does secure things, and then the other guy draws stuff. Who we are is boring with the exception of the interplay between security and IT. When I was working with Tim, the sysadmin who helped me make this game, I would frequently bring him systems or ideas and I say, hey, review this, check this out. And frequently the response was, great, you made a data prison. This is so boring and none of your users are actually going to want to do anything with this. These dwarves and elves in this game are going to just throw this thing in the trash and use a bunch of tin cans connected with strings to communicate because you've made a data prison. Way to go, security guy. So that interplay was actually super helpful throughout the development process. So for maybe like the 5 of you in this audience who don't know what a tabletop role-playing game is, here's the short version. It's basically Star Wars Kid meets like military war planning and war gaming. The description we've settled on is it's basically like when kids are in a playground playing pretend, except it's for adults, and disputes are basically handled with dice rolls and rules. That's all it is. It's like communal storytelling for grown-ups. So why did we make a game that's a fantasy tabletop role-playing game that's about IT and hacking? For 3 reasons. 1, we thought it'd be a fun way to kind of reach out to a community who is not technical, although there's a lot of overlap as we've seen in this audience. Basically reach out to tabletop gamers and say, hey, this stuff is for you, we want you to learn this stuff and have fun with it. And it's actually not as hard and not as inaccessible as sometimes the security community makes it. Next, because we've all seen this, Hollywood hacking is terribly, terribly boring. Obviously that's changed with stuff like Mr. Robot, but historically, hacking or IT security in almost any media is boring as sin. And lastly, because there's very pervasive ideas where people say stuff like, I don't care, I have nothing to hide, when it comes to surveillance, generally. It's a lazy argument, but it's a very, very powerful and pervasive argument. So basically, this is a gentle form of activism to try to get people who don't wear a tinfoil hat, aren't in IT, don't want to destroy the system, basically kind of nudge them and let us kind of understand some of our perspectives. So here's hacking in RPGs to summarize, or better yet, with a graph. So basically in a game, there'll be some kind of scenario where somebody wants to get the data. There is some kind of obstacle, usually a firewall, and then there's a character who goes into this like cyber trance and just hammers away at the keyboard. Somebody at the table rolls a die and gets a 20 or something, and then bam, you have the data. So that's a useful abstraction for people who really don't care about IT or hacking. They just kind of like, it makes sense. But for anybody who's in our industry, this is absolutely boring. You didn't learn anything. You didn't actually learn how a system worked and deconstruct it and then abuse it in ways that the author never anticipated. You did not hack a thing, you rolled the dice. So we're trying to change that even with non-technical people. And then lastly, again, the nothing to hide argument, super pervasive. So this game is sort of a manifesto against that. I defer to Wikipedia for all my legal needs and everything, so you should too. Okay, enough about talking about the game. Let's actually do an RFC. So yeah, treat this like this is actually a technical review. I'm asking you, IT and security scholars, to actually challenge me on some of the concepts here. Okay, so like I said, this is a traditional tabletop fantasy game. There's dudes chucking fireballs and there's people killing orcs. Moving on. Next, there's this meta plot of the Risk Eaters. It's basically this organization that is the cross between the NSA and the Spanish Inquisition, and they're basically chasing down the characters in the game and doing bad, terrible things to them. So the players are always on the run from this organization that loves to do surveillance and control the world. Moving on. And then lastly, this fantasy world is connected by something called the Shardscape, which is basically kind of like the modern internet. The rest of this talk is going to be breaking down exactly how this works, what it looks like in the game space, and why it matters. So we're going to start with Cryptomancy 101. First of all, on the cover of the book, there's this elf lady that's holding this gem. That's a shard. Think of it as a mobile endpoint, like your phone. With the exception of there's no storage or data persistence on that thing. It's merely a communication channel. Okay? So the way it works is somebody can grab one of these shards, they can think something, and what they think is transmitted to another shard. But it's not that simple. So you take a large shard and you break it into an equal number of pieces, and now you basically have a private shard net. So shard nets, it's basically a private network of things connected to each other. However, it's not as easy as just saying, I want to communicate with that shard. Actually, the way it works is if you create a message from your head through this crystal to this private network, it actually doesn't go to a single shard, it goes to all of them. So in that sense, these messages or echoes, we'll explain why we call them that, are basically like UDP packets over a wireless network. Basically, unless precautions are taken, everything is in clear text, and every message goes to every member of that private network. Now, I talked about there's no data persistence on the actual endpoint, but there actually is in an individual shard net. So if a shard net is composed of 6 individual shards, a message will echo throughout that private network for a number of hours equal to the sum of the shards that compose that shard net. So here are 2 simple examples, 6 shards, 6 hours. And that's why they're called echoes. In fact, there's no real timestamp on these messages, but what there is brand new messages will appear very, very vibrant and bright and fresh, and messages that are old will be continually degrade where you can't even see them anymore. So in a case where you have a simple shard net that's composed of 6 shards and there's a brand new message, you know it was in the last couple of minutes, but if it's further degraded, you know, oh, this message maybe happened 3 to 4 hours ago or more. Now that creates a problem. When all these messages that you're sending are going to everybody on that private shard net and not just an individual, you basically have a situation where you have no privacy. So how do you solve that problem? Okay, we're going to do some Alice and Bob stuff, and of course anytime we see Alice and Bob, there's always Chuck, who has been basically eavesdropping since math was invented. He's always there. But in this case, you have Alice and Bob are trying to communicate with each other securely on a private shard net, but you have an eavesdropper on their network. Yes, sir?
That could be like 6 or 4 hours.
Yep.
They send a message for a shard network, and near the end of the message duration, click your shard. Can you extend the life?
Yeah, you cannot. The question was, can you sort of extend the life of an echo in any means by either reducing the number of shards you have in your network or expanding your network? You can't. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those scenarios, though. So back to Alice, Bob, and Chuck. Again, Alice and Bob want to communicate securely on a network where there's an eavesdropper. So the problem is, if she sends a message, because Chuck is on the same network, Chuck is going to get that. So here come key phrases, which essentially works like symmetric encryption. The way it works is Alice is going to grab her shard. She's going to raise a hand, which tells the shard that she's about to encrypt her message. While she's holding her hand, anything she thinks is now basically the key that's going to be used to encrypt her message until she lowers her hand. At that point, anything she thinks, any clear text messages she thinks, is going to be encrypted with that key phrase and sent over the wire. It's going to be sent to everything in that network. Now, someone who knows the key phrase, because maybe she shared this key phrase with Bob before they hopped on the network, anybody who knows a key phrase, that ciphertext is going to turn into clear text. They'll get the message. Anybody who doesn't know that key phrase is not going to, they're just going to see ciphertext, just complete nonsense. And it's as simple as that. Bob knows the key phrase because they shared it beforehand, and now Chuck, he's hosed. So there's a couple caveats where I'm going to deviate from real life in this like IT abstraction just because we had to make some hard decisions when it came to how do we make this work in a tabletop scenario as opposed to in IT. So in this environment, this imaginary environment, a key phrase is either known or unknown. You can't just sit there and guess. And also, decryption in this setting is instant and automatic. As long as you have heard, read, or uttered a key phrase in your entire life, you have the ability to decrypt any message that was encrypted with that key phrase. So basically, your ability to decrypt messages on a network is based on your own sort of mental lexicon of everything you've ever heard or read or said in your life. We'll talk about scenarios where people can kind of artificially expand that in the game setting. So if that's the case, then choosing your key is super important. So we're going to walk through a couple scenarios. Again, this doesn't match real life where it's all about like length and entropy of keys and passwords, but you'll understand where we're going with this. So let's work through some weak key phrases and then get to some stronger ones. So in this setting, if somebody uses the phrase, "Don't look a gift horse in the mouth," as their key phrase to encrypt their payload, is that going to work? Well, no, because almost every adult in their life has heard this key phrase. Like, everybody's heard this. So they'll be able to decrypt any payload that is encrypted with this key phrase. Next, here's another one. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. Who recognizes this? Okay, so it's strong. So if I wanted to communicate only with the people who read William Gibson's Neuromancer in this audience, I would have used that key phrase. But again, that might be bad. I might think, oh, nobody's read this thing. It's a strong key phrase. But no, there's a couple people in the audience who would have got that one. So some smaller and interesting examples. So in a fantasy setting, a key phrase to encrypt a message might be godlings, goblets, gremlins. So people don't say this. This like doesn't make sense. This is whatever. But at the same time, if this actor has a history of using only nouns, maybe 3 nouns in a row, using alliteration, only using plural nouns, then potentially whoever used that could be susceptible to certain types of attacks. And then lastly, the shortest and dumbest of the key phrases, but in this setting, the most powerful, is the phrase "swimming the food." Swimming the food doesn't make sense. No one here has ever said that. It does not compute. It's kind of like nonsense. It's just 3 simple words thrown together. And in this setting, it makes it a pretty powerful key phrase because it's not something somebody would know or use. Okay, so what about the problem where, okay, we've been using this key phrase to secure our communication from the eavesdropper Chuck, but now somehow he figured out our key phrase. So how are we going to exchange new keys in an environment where we have a hostile actor on the network? So here's Chuck kind of laughing. I know their key phrase. I'm going to win. I'm going to intercept their traffic. And there, he's doing it right there. So to solve this problem, in the setting you have something called true name and sole key cryptography, which is essentially asymmetric encryption. So all the characters, they have a common name, the name that all their friends call them, the name they share on the street, whatever. They have a true name, which is a name their parents gave them. It's universally unique in this setting, so only one person has it. And then associated with that true name is a soul key, which is a word that's so complex even the person who owns it doesn't know it, but they can invoke it for cryptographic tasks. Now, if you're in security, you've probably already seen what this is. This is basically public and private key cryptography, but it's bound to an individual. So anybody who encrypts with Alice's true name, in this case Alicia, well, nobody can decrypt that. The only person who can is the person that has the corresponding soul key. So in this case, only Alice. And of course, if Alice decides to invoke her soul key and encrypt with it, the only thing that decrypts it is her true name, meaning only people who know her true name can decrypt a message that she created using that soul key or that private key. So here, again, Chuck can't decrypt this message. So Bob encrypted a message with Alice's true name, and even if Chuck knows Alice's true name, he still can't decrypt it because he doesn't have that soul key. So what about a scenario where, okay, sure, Bob can use Alice's true name to encrypt something and send it to her and make sure that only she can get it, but how is she going to respond back? So again, this is very easily solved. So here's the scenario again. Bob knows Alice's true name, but not vice versa. Maybe he doesn't trust her enough to give his true name or some other reason. But here's how we're going to solve that. So Bob is going to use Alice's true name to encrypt. The payload is going to be, hey, our new key phrase is swimming the food. Alice is going to encrypt with the key phrase swimming the food. Her payload is going to be copy that. And then he's going to say, I wonder what Chuck, who's been eavesdropping, is doing during this time. And Chuck is not happy because he's been defeated. This also solves another problem in this kind of setting of verifying identity. So here's a situation where Chuck wants to eavesdrop as Alice, or masquerade as Alice, pretend to be her. So basically, he's going to use the key phrase that he knew and discovered to encrypt. And then he's going to say, hey, it's Alice, Chuck is dead, let's go back to using our old key, shall we? So what Bob's going to do is he's going to create a challenge question encrypted with Alice's true name, one that she could only respond to because she's the only one who sees it. So he says, prove to me it's you, tell me I'm awesome. So Chuck's going to try to do some social engineering and again say, I said it was safe, what's the holdup, let's go back. And of course, even in clear text, Bob will say, F off, Chuck, get off our network, dude. Okay, so if asymmetric encryption is so awesome, why would anybody use symmetric encryption? It's a matter of scalability. So here's two simple scenarios. One, you have all kinds of like operatives that are in the field and they want to lay an ambush on somebody, and they want to do that thing where it's like, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, or hold until my signal. We're going to wait for them to come and then we'll all shoot simultaneously. So if you're using a shared key phrase, it's as simple as sending a message with that shared key phrase that your whole squad knows and saying, attack. Now everybody's attacking simultaneously. Now let's try to scale that with true name crypto or asymmetric crypto. It looks like this. Your name, attack. Your name, attack. Your name, attack. So on and so forth. So you see how that kind of breaks down. Secondly, maybe there's a business case for having a private like chat channels that are pretty responsive, where maybe you want to have these folks in the group, keep this person out of the group. So here's another scenario. Take the same folks, but one guy's in charge and the rest report to that guy. And he says, where are you idiots? You're late. And he broadcasts that on the network. And of course, you know, they want to say boss is such an a-hole to each other without boss actually seeing it. So in the field, they've shared a key phrase that only they know, but the boss doesn't. Okay, so those are the like bare bones fundamentals of how the game works. So now what we're going to do is take some of those really simple cryptographic concepts and apply them to larger systems. We've already talked about private networks. Now we're going to talk about bridging private networks, and we're going to keep scaling that to enterprise-sized networks that are also interacting with something like the internet. Okay, so how do private networks talk to each other? Again, if you have a shard net, only the members of that shard net can communicate with each other. The others can't. So how do you solve that problem? So here's an example of what it looks like. There's somebody talking and only the other people in a shard net are getting those messages. So all you have to do is basically bridge the two networks. So basically there's a character in the setting that is holding a shard from one shardnet in one hand, a shard from the other shardnet in the other hand, and they basically become a router for those two networks to talk to each other. That person is no longer an active participant. They can listen, but basically they've become a piece of network hardware. In the game we call those bridges, and they bridge networks. So here's some examples of why you would do that. So let's say you have an organization that has a business case to actually decompartmentalize different people that are communicating with each other. Here you have a single admin who sort of manages the relationship between a group of analysts back at headquarters and a bunch of operators that are out in the field. The reason they want to keep these networks separate is because maybe the operators like to talk to each other and say, man, we blew up this village. I hope HQ doesn't find out, that sucks. Meanwhile, the analysts are back at HQ saying, we totally set these guys on a suicide mission, I hope they don't find out. And then the crypto admin says, would everybody shut up, I need to kind of bridge the communication here. And then when they're all talking to each other on the same network, then both sides pretend that everything's going hunky-dory. So to the idea of the persistence of those messages or echoes, in this case, again, we've composed one big network now of these two smaller shardnets that have 6 each. So now each echo resonates for about 12 hours. This gets interesting if you're trying to detect an unauthorized breach, because any messages that happen while an adversary is connecting your two networks are now going to resonate for 12 hours. So if you're creating kind of like a timestamp echo every hour that says the time is 6 o'clock, and you know that should expire at midnight, and you see that thing keep rolling after midnight, you know you had a problem. So what about scenarios? That was a scenario where you had a single enterprise that had a business case to compartmentalize 2 organizations. But what about you have one where people just don't trust each other, period? They're not on the same team. So for example, in politics, you have a case where sometimes folks need to come together to actually talk about stuff and do business, but generally speaking, they want to keep each other at arm's length and keep each other out of their networks. It's almost like you need a big internet to serve as a buffer between those two. So on that note, we're going to start talking about the Shardscape, which is basically the internet of this setting. So think of the Shardscape as a private network, except it's just really, really big. Instead of 5 or 6 shards, you're talking 10,000 or more. And so if you take the idea of echoes resonating for a number of hours equal to the members, you're talking about a single message is going to persist in the shardnet for longer than a year. And if you have people creating them all the time, you're going to have hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of echoes in this environment. What that creates actually is a massive queryable database, sort of like the internet. You can jump on a browser and look for something. When you connect to the internet, it's not like the mass of the internet's knowledge is blasting into your brain. You actually have to sort of query it. So that's kind of how it works here. It's much slower than a private network. But if you know what you're looking for, you can find it. And kind of here's how that works. You connect to the Shardscape, and you think really hard about a certain string. And what's going to return to you is any clear text string of whatever you thought of. So in this case, the price of bread. Basically, what's going to rise above all the noise that you're seeing is messages where people are talking about the price of bread. At the same time, if anybody's using the price of bread as a key phrase to encrypt their message, you're also going to see the contents of that. So you can use this to basically tag certain communications. If you want to make sure everybody reads your message, you'll encrypt it with the word news. Everybody knows the word news. So basically now when anybody connects to the Shardscape and thinks of news, it's going to decrypt your news story, even if they don't know the contents of the news story, and it'll rise to the top depending on the freshness. Okay, so if the internet is a massive, if the Shardscape and the internet are massive queryable databases, they're also home to a place where everyone hates you. At least that's been my experience on the internet. So the problem is, do you really want to bridge your private network with this scary, horrible place? A little background on this picture right here. So I've given a bunch of talks on software as a service and storing your data in the cloud, and sort of helping people cope with the problem of what's clinically called nephophobia, which is irrational fear of clouds. So I'm a big cloud guy. But anyway, the joke was if you give your average security engineer a bunch of crayons and you have them draw their feelings, half the time it's going to look something like this. It's going to be a bright, cheery day, and then it's going to be like, man, if it wasn't for that internet and its stupid dog, like this job would be gravy. My work is so hard. By the way, the other 50% of the time, the drawing looks like this, but I'm not going to touch that one at all. Okay, so going back to the internet and securely bridging your private network, your private shard net with the scary Shardscape. So here we have this big steam-powered octopus-looking thing that has many arms, and it's actually holding these different shards in its arms. We're going to walk through what this guy is right here. So think of a firewall. A firewall, if it had a baby with like a proxy and a NAT interface, and then it had this giant squid sitting on top of it, but it was also like a steampunk squid, so I'm giving it a monocle and a top hat. And each of its hands is actually holding an individual shard from separate private shard nets. So it's actually connecting them, sort of. It also is connected to the Shardscape, which is that big, scary network I talked about previously. And in its remaining hands, it's actually documenting everything it sees as fast as it possibly can. Every message that's coming through as fast as it can. So in the game setting, these are called golems. And again, these are pieces of network hardware. So if I was a vendor and I was trying to sell you one in this setting, I will talk about its features. So some of its features, it securely connects hostile networks. So actually the golem with its arms holding these shards, it's actually not creating a bridge. What it's doing is it's connecting to a shard net, getting an order, dropping that connection, connecting to another shard net, and then relaying whatever that order was. So there's never any direct connection. It's actually mediating between these two environments. It also has real-time logging. Again, this thing is writing down everything it sees. So later, if you need to do some IR or do an investigation, this thing is actually logging everything that's happening, whether it's good or malicious. And you can review that in this big dusty tome that this thing's writing with ink. It can also automate tasks. So one simple example would be it can create a banner in a network, and basically it will broadcast constantly so anybody who enters that environment sees it. So it might say, welcome to this network, please authenticate with your username and password, any abusers of the system will be tortured to death, or whatever's fitting for this kind of setting. And then lastly, it generates its own true name and corresponding sole key, so people can connect to this thing directly and securely. As far as like vendor features go, you'll notice it's missing threat intel. Again, that's because this game is based on real-life IT security and not fantasy. Thank you. A couple people who laughed. Okay, so let's talk about how this works in the game. Alice and Bob communicating again. You got a golem in between them. Bob is connected to the blue network. The golem is also, and then the golem is also connected to the red network, and so is Alice. So Bob wants to communicate to Alice across this thing. It's going to encrypt with the golem's true name, which only the golem knows. It's going to instruct it, I want you to encrypt my message with the key phrase, swimming the food, and then send the payload, hello Alice. Golem's going to drop that connection, connect to the red network, encrypt with the key phrase it was instructed to encrypt with, and deliver the payload, which Alice will get. Alice will reply using the golem's true name and say encrypt with swimming the food, which is our new key phrase, and say to Bob, hello Bob, and then the golem will do that. Okay, but what about a scenario where they're not part of again, not part of the same enterprise, you don't have trust. This is somebody on a private network that wants to reach out, traverse the golem, go to the Shardscape, and communicate with somebody they maybe met somewhere. In this scenario, Bob wants to speak to Alice, who is on the Shardscape. They met sometime before, so they agreed on a key phrase, and now we're going to see that in action, what it looks like. So in this case, Alice is not totally trusted. She doesn't know the golem's true name, and she's not part of that same network. She is on the Shardscape. So what Bob's going to do is encrypt with the golem's true name, tell it to use that key phrase that they agreed on previously. He's going to say, I want you to start listening for this new key phrase, tether, trolloping, trolls. And then the payload is going to be, hello Alice, use the key phrase, tether, trolloping, trolls. So golem is going to drop the connection, connect to the Shardscape, use the key phrase it was instructed to encrypt with, and deliver the payload. Hello Alice, use the key, tether, trolloping, trolls. Remember, the golem was instructed to listen for this new key phrase, so it sort of started listening for that, or opened up a port, or whatever the IT analogy might be that's simplest for folks. So she's going to use the key phrase that she was told in the payload to start using. She's going to encrypt with it because, again, she wants the golem to see this, but she's also instructing the golem, when you connect to those other private networks, I want you to also encrypt with this key phrase. And she's telling Bob this is the worst password ever. And of course, Bob gets the message that he has the worst key phrase ever. Okay, so we sort of scaled some of these ideas. I'm checking my time here. We're doing good. We scaled some of these ideas. We talked a little bit about enterprise and different business units or different levels of trust having to communicate with each other. So now we're going to talk about breaking all these things, or OffSec, or being a dick. So first up, we're going to start with code breakers. So this is where the game sort of introduces the concept of brute force attacks or dictionary attacks. So in this setting, Alice actually got a hold of one of the shards of Bob's private network. So she's trying to eavesdrop, but man, everybody is encrypting all the things. What am I going to do? Nobody's using simple, stupid key phrases that I need. I can't get any work done here. So there's the message going encrypted to her. She's not getting it. She's struggling. So what is she going to do? She's going to create a bridge, an unauthorized bridge, from her network to theirs. Now again, she can't do much. She's just sitting back and listening. But now she's teaming up with Chuck, who's part of a group of code breakers or crackers. So Chuck is now listening to any communications that are happening over this network. So what makes Chuck special? Here's the traffic going to Chuck. Okay, so think of a slot machine. Probably most folks have been to Vegas. You play the slot machine, you have these reels of different symbols and numbers, and they rotate, and sometimes you win just so you can keep losing more money over a longer duration. And then the center string is sort of, depending on how you bet, that's the one that matters, right? So take this idea and scale it really big. Think of a massive steam-powered doohickey created by dwarves that is basically like a giant slot machine. But instead of numbers and symbols, it actually has these massive reels of words that rotate. And every couple of seconds, it will rotate and basically create a new readable string for anybody who has just a high tolerance for tedium. It's just sitting there staring at this thing. But what they're doing is they're expanding their mental lexicon of key phrases they can use to decrypt. So if you have a much bigger one, this is great because not only do you have this 6-word string of totally random letters or numbers, or key phrases rather, but also this actually is multiple key phrases. So it's not just a string of 6 words, it's actually 3 strings of 2 words, so on and so forth. So that can be pretty powerful. Now I know people who are good at math will say it'll take you about 70 million years to figure out enough to break X number of whatever. But also, you know what? Dragons aren't real either. This is about teaching people kind of how the stuff works. So again, I don't want to make light of it, but the math does not really jive here. But again, you get the concept. So basically what happened there is now that Chuck is listening and he's been expanding his mental lexicon. So all these encrypted messages being sent by Bob, they traverse the bridge that was created, and now Chuck can decrypt those for Alice. Chuck gives the key phrase to Alice, and now she is decrypting all the things. Hooray. So to the point of how hard this is, or how long it would take for somebody sitting there in front of the slot machine kind of absorbing new key phrases. So if somebody wants to do this well, they can create custom reels. So we talked about the reels, basically containing random words. So if you actually really want to target an adversary and crack whatever key phrases they're using in the setting, you're going to learn as much about them as you can, their occupation, what they like to do, who their friends are, and basically you're going to create custom reels based on what you think that person's mental lexicon of words is. So if somebody was targeting me, they'd say, okay, he's a moron, he's a degenerate who likes fart jokes, that's all we know about him. So basically this is how the custom reels would look. It'd be that simple, and you'd basically be able to crack any key phrase that I personally am using. Okay, now we're going to talk about some network stuff, shard storms, which is basically denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks. So here's a very, very simple DOS attack that wouldn't be effective. So in this case, Alice has created a bridge between Bob's private network and the Shardscape. So now those millions and millions of echoes we've talked about, they're going to traverse her and basically start hammering Bob's private network. That's really bad. He's not going to be able to do normal business. It's going to take forever. But this isn't that problematic because Bob at least has the ability to geolocate the shard that's in his private shard net. So it could be problematic for Alice. We'll just figure out where the problem is and solve, right? So what if Alice wants to do a DDoS attack and she doesn't want any attribution or anybody to figure out where that's coming from? So in this case, Bob is now behind a golem. Alice does not have access to one of those individual shards. It's spooky up here now. So keep in mind, from the previous iteration, the golem is still listening for this key phrase, tether, trolloping, trolls. So basically, Alice is going to do some search engine optimization here. She's going to encrypt her payload with the word news, which everybody's looking for. She's going to mix that with a little 419 scam. She's going to say $1 million to the first response I see using this key phrase, tether, trolloping, trolls. So what's going to happen? The entire internet is going to encrypt with the key phrase that the golem has been instructed to listen for, and is going to get perpetually hammered by everybody and their mom that wants to get this $1 million. And remember, with the freshness of the echoes, where the most recent one comes first, that means everybody's just going to keep holding their shard and saying, please send me the money, please send me the money, and it's just going to continue. And a golem, since it's steam-powered, it's going to be under such duress, it's going to be bad news. It's going to throw a rod. It's probably going to scribble so fast in that tone that it's going to set it on fire, burning all your logs, and it might even belch out the content of your private networks out onto the interwebs. If Bob was smart, he would have instructed the golem to stop listening for that key phrase after that session that he had established. And also, if Bob was smart, he would not have shared the golem's true name with Alice, because she can open up that port again, and now the golem's getting slammed again. Okay, we're going to talk about offensive cryptomancy. Got a couple minutes left here. So this is basically people using cryptography to do bad things instead of defensive things. So simplest example would be ransomware. Now, we've been talking about Alice, Bob, and Chuck in sort of a traditional crypto way, but keep in mind this is a tabletop role-playing game where people roll dice and kill orcs. So these are also like cool fantasy characters or whatever, walking around a shared fantasy space, doing stuff, leveling up, whatever. I don't care anymore. So there are spells in the game, because obviously there's magic in these games, that do cryptographic things in the meat space. So you have a spell called Babble, which you can encrypt your voice or somebody else's voice. Dissemble, encrypt your face or somebody else's face. Maze, decrypt a physical space, such as that door. And the way this works is somebody raises a hand, casts this, encrypts the thing, whether it's your face, your voice, or a door, or whatever. And anybody who doesn't know the key phrase actually can't see it. They can't do anything. If somebody encrypts that door, you can't walk out unless you know the key phrase. So that's how that works. Now let's talk about being a jerk with that stuff. In one scenario, I can cast Babble on myself, encrypt my own voice, so I can hear myself, I know what I'm saying, but unless I've shared the key with you, you don't. Next, I'm going to encrypt your voice. Let's say I'm one of the bad guys and I'm interrogating you. I've encrypted your voice. You don't know the key phrase I used to encrypt your voice, because I encrypted my voice first, so now you can't share that key phrase with other people, and then I'm going to go ahead and encrypt your face. So now you're talking about a character in this setting who basically lost their face, lost their voice, and they can't get those things back unless they do what the person wants them to do. So go out and do this, perform these evil deeds for me, and I'll give you your identity back. Cryptoterrorism, I can't believe is this word coined yet? I'm sure it will be. In this setting, it would work as simple as somebody casting Maze to encrypt the exit of a door with a very complex key phrase, setting that building on fire, and that's really bad. And now you have a situation where the authorities really probably should make it a crime to use this type of magic, although the private sector would probably come back and say, we need to use this to defend our assets and maintain privacy or whatever. So the authorities will say, okay, we'll have some kind of great key escrow system where you can share your keys with the authorities, and they'll protect those really well. But then they'll say, while we're at it, we could have stopped that act of terrorism if we also got your communication keys, so why don't you give us those too? And so on and so forth. Another situation, now a good situation of solving problems instead of creating them. Alice has encountered a door she can't get past because it's been encrypted. So she's going to contact her codebreaker buddy again and say, hey, crack this door for me. He's going to cast a spell that lets him look through shards as if they were IP cameras and visually investigate the door and see if he knows the code to actually decrypt that. Gives a key phrase to Alice, problem solved. But that also opens up a can of worms, because what you have is basically a video surveillance network, scalable, expandable video surveillance networks in a traditional Tolkien fantasy setting. And this is where I'm wrapping things up on the topic of surveillance. I do touch a lot on physical security in this book because that was actually my background before I got into InfoSec. The book covers a bunch of clandestine tradecraft as well as traditional physical security stuff. I touch on this stuff lightly. I was not in the clandestine service. They said I was too fat. But I covered this stuff extensively. But the area where I actually do have a lot of background is analytical tradecraft. Specifically, I'm formally trained in social network analysis. So what this book actually does is it teaches people to visually represent the human networks of an adversary you're trying to fight. So you can identify the actors with the most centrality or the most friends as important actors in those networks, as well as establish who's a broker or a gatekeeper. Basically an individual node that is a single node connecting disparate groups of actors. So you can really leverage that gatekeeper to influence those two other parties. Here's an example that's actually in the game where I've scaled this from a private, like small network to like strategic networks of different factions having different levels of relationships with each other, basically inviting the players to say, hey, if you want a certain political outcome while working with all these factions, here's what you need to know about how they get along, who knows who hates who, and then maybe see if you can exploit that. But also map this out as you're playing. Okay, some concluding remarks. One reason I wanted to present this at a big security conference is I just want to create a community of fellow closeted nerd gamers who are out there, who are also in IT, and basically just see if folks are interested in doing this type of thing. Not only playing my game, but also seeing if we can just put more good networking, IT, and cryptography, and privacy, and surveillance literature in media. Because again, historically it's been pretty bad. And in terms of background, like I want all these mindsets, whether you're like a security engineer or you dress up and with elvirs and fight in the forest, like whatever, or if you like doing other stuff, it's cool. This is my contact info. Feel free to hit me up. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. Now, I talked about a game about rolling dice and killing orcs, but you could probably take a similar framework and monetize it and turn it into some kind of corporate tabletoping exercise product. If somebody wants to talk about doing that or whatever, I'd love to help, so hit me up. And I'll leave you with an anecdote. I chatted with a guy on social media who actually played this game, bought the game, ran it for a bunch of people at a gaming convention. His background was he's from the Navy, and he actually got sort of interested in information security when the OPM lost all of his data. But he had a heck of a time getting in because we all know it's actually a really hard field to break into. But anyway, playing this game sort of reminded him and brought together some of the disparate stuff he read and sort of gave him a framework to learn the stuff better. But more importantly, he told me he was running this for people, playing it and teaching them these concepts and asking them to use these concepts in play. And he told me he saw the light bulb go off above their head. So we're talking about somebody who's not in the industry is becoming a teacher of cryptography and networking to other people who are not in the industry. And that's awesome. I'm damn proud of that, and I consider that like one of the coolest things I've done in my career. So anyway, please hit me up if you want to chat about stuff. That's all I got. Thanks, everybody. We got 5 minutes for questions. Yep. I will host a